The colony ship New Dawn was carrying 50,000 people to their new home among the stars. Families had packed their entire lives into cargo holds, dreaming of fresh air and open skies on a distant world. Children pressed their faces against observation windows. Watching the stars drift by like scattered diamonds, Captain Lee Minho had made this journey dozens of times before. He knew every sound his ship made, every vibration that ran through her hull. So when the first plasma cannon struck, he felt it in his bones before the alarms even started screaming. The bridge erupted in chaos. Red emergency lights bathed everything in an angry glow as the massive ship shuddered like a wounded animal. Through the main viewport, Minho watched in pure horror as 12 enormous alien warships materialized from hyperspace. They appeared. Out of nowhere, their black holes so dark they seemed to swallow the starlight itself, shields down to 60%. Communications officer Park Soo-jin yelled over the noise. Her fingers flew across her control panel, but nothing was working right. "Captain, they're jamming everything. I can't get any distress signals through." Minho gripped his command chair so hard his knuckles turned white. He had heard the stories, the whispered reports from the outer colonies. The Zenthari Empire had been moving through this section of space like a plague, wiping out entire civilizations. 23 different species had already been completely destroyed. No survivors, no mercy, no exceptions. Now it was humanity's turn to face extinction. The enemy ships moved with terrifying precision. Each one was the size of a city, bristling with weapons that could crack planets in half. They spread out in perfect formation, surrounding the New Dawn like wolves circling wounded prey. There was no escape. There never had been. "All hands abandon ship," Minho shouted into his communicator, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew it was useless. Through the viewport, he watched the alien ships systematically destroying every escape pod that launched. Bright flashes of light marked where families had been moments before. The Zenthari left absolutely nothing to chance. Deep in the ships, reactor room engineer Kim Dae-ho was trying to keep the power systems running. He had been working on the ship for 5 years, and he knew every pipe, every circuit, every bolt. The reactor was his baby, and he was fighting to keep her alive even as the ship died around him. The whole breach happened so fast that Dae-ho barely had time to think. One moment he was checking power readings. The next moment, the entire section exploded outward. The force of the blast hurled him through the gap like a rag doll, his emergency suit automatically sealing around him as he tumbled helplessly into the cold vacuum of space. Behind him, the New Dawn was breaking apart. Sections of hull peeled away like flower petals, revealing the bright fires burning inside. Then came the final explosion as the main reactor went critical. The ship that had been home to 50,000 people disappeared in a brilliant flash of light that lit up the entire star system. Dae-ho spun through the void, watching pieces of his world scatter in every direction. Chunks of metal, personal belongings, and things he didn't want to think about drifted past him in the darkness. The silence was absolute. No screams, no alarms, no sounds of life. Just the cold emptiness of space. The Zenthari ships moved through. The debris field like giant vacuum cleaners, their sensors sweeping back and forth. They were checking for survivors, making sure their work was complete. Their scanners found nothing. No life signs. No heartbeats. No hope. Satisfied that every human was dead, the alien fleet simply vanished back into hyperspace. They left behind only twisted metal and the memory of 50,000 lives, snuffed out in minutes. But the Zenthari had made one critical mistake. In all their careful planning and methodical destruction, they had overlooked something important about humans. Sometimes, against all odds and logic, humans simply refused to die, floating in the wreckage of his world. Kim Dae-ho was still breathing. Dae-ho floated in the darkness, spinning slowly as pieces of his destroyed home drifted past him. His emergency suit was keeping him alive, but barely. The display inside his helmet showed the harsh reality in glowing red numbers. Oxygen, 6 hours remaining. Water recycler, damaged beyond repair. Emergency beacon, completely destroyed in the explosion. Any sane person would have closed their eyes and waited for the end. The void of space was utterly silent, cold enough to freeze blood in seconds, and empty of everything needed for life. It was the perfect place to die, and most beings would have accepted that fact. But humans had never been known for being reasonable. Deho's engineering mind was already working, analyzing the debris field around him like a puzzle that needed solving. Everywhere he looked, he saw pieces of the new dawn scattered across kilometers of space. Most of it was useless junk now, but some of it might still work. Some of it might keep him breathing just a little longer. He grabbed a twisted piece of hull plating and held it in front of him like a shield. Sharp fragments of metal were everywhere, and one wrong move could tear his suit open. Moving carefully, he began to search through the wreckage, looking for anything that might help him survive. The medical bay had been completely destroyed, but one of its water recycling units had somehow survived intact. Deho carefully maneuvered it into his makeshift collection, using his suit's small thruster pack to push it along. The unit was designed to turn human waste back into drinking water, and right now it was more valuable than gold. Next, he found a damaged shuttle that had been blown clear of the main ship. Its hull was cracked open like an egg, but the emergency supply compartments were still sealed. Inside, he discovered something that made his heart race with hope. Emergency ration packs. Enough food to last him weeks if he was careful. But the real prize came when he spotted a section of the command deck drifting nearby. The quantum communicator array was still attached, its crystalline components glowing faintly with stored energy. If he could get it working, he might be able to call for help, or at least let someone know that humanity hadn't died quietly. The hardest part was finding shelter. Space was trying to kill him in a dozen different ways, and his suit wasn't meant for long-term survival. Then he saw it, a large cargo container that had been blown clear of the ship. Its sides were dented, and one end was completely missing. But it was big enough to live in. Deho spent hours pushing and pulling his salvaged equipment into the container. His suit's repair kit contained polymer foam designed to seal small holes, and he used every bit of it to patch the container's breaches. The work was exhausting, and his oxygen levels kept dropping, but he refused to give up. When he finally sealed himself inside his makeshift home, it wasn't much to look at. The walls were dented metal, the floor was whatever debris he could find, and air leaked out through a dozen tiny holes he couldn't reach. But it was pressurized. It was warm, and it was keeping him alive. The Zenthari had scanned the debris field with their advanced sensors, looking for any signs of life. They had found nothing because they were looking for normal life signs in normal places. They never imagined that someone could survive in a thrown-together shelter made from scrap metal in desperation. Days passed in the cold darkness. Deho worked constantly, improving his shelter, fixing his recycled air system, and trying to get the communicator working. His hands were cut and bruised from handling sharp metal. His body ached from the cramped conditions, and his mind was clouded with exhaustion, but he kept working. Every human has something deep inside them that refuses to quit, even when quitting makes perfect sense. The Zenthari had studied 23 different species, and they had never encountered this particular form of madness. They were about to learn why leaving even one human alive was the biggest mistake they could make. After 3 days of working in his cramped metal shelter, Deho finally managed to get the ship's damaged computer core working again. The quantum processors were cracked, and half the memory banks were fried, but enough remained to access the tactical data that had been automatically recorded during the attack. What he found made his blood run cold. The files were filled with detailed analysis of human behavior, military capabilities, and psychological profiles. Page after page of data showed that the Zenthari had been studying humanity for years before they attacked. This wasn't some random act of violence or territorial expansion. This was a carefully planned execution. Humanity had been marked for complete extinction, and the reason why made Deho's hand shake as he read through the reports. According to Zenthari research, humans represented what they called a chaos variable in their perfectly ordered empire. Every other species in the galaxy followed predictable patterns that could be calculated and controlled. But humans were different. Dangerously different. The files showed the fate of 23 other civilizations that had faced the Xanthari war machine. Each species had been studied, cataloged, and then eliminated using the exact same tactics. The Xanthari would analyze their enemies' behavioral patterns, predict their responses, and then exploit those predictions to achieve total victory. The Korathi had been a proud warrior race, but they always fought with honor and followed ancient battle codes. The Xanthari used this predictability against them, luring their fleets into traps by exploiting their need for honorable combat. The Villani were brilliant scientists who always chose logic over emotion. The Xanthari simply presented them with logical arguments for why surrender was the only rational choice. Every species had fallen because they were predictable. They followed patterns, rules, and systems that made sense to them. The Xanthari could study these patterns and turn them into weapons, but humans were chaos incarnate. Where other species followed logical military doctrine, humans would suddenly change tactics for no apparent reason. Where others would surrender when defeat was mathematically certain, humans would fight even harder. Where others sought order and structure, humans thrived in confusion and uncertainty. The Xanthari researchers had spent years trying to understand human behavior, and their conclusions were fascinating and terrifying. Humans didn't just adapt to changing situations. They actively created chaos as a survival strategy. They would break their own rules, abandon their own plans, and do things that made no logical sense. All because some deep instinct told them it was the right thing to do. The aliens viewed this as a contamination that could spread throughout their empire. If other species learned to think like humans, to embrace chaos instead of order, the Xantharis' perfect system would collapse. Humanity had to be eliminated, not because they were strong, but because they were unpredictable. Deho found himself grinning as he read through the enemy's military protocols. The Xanthari were incredibly advanced, with technology that seemed almost magical. Their ships were faster, their weapons more powerful, and their numbers overwhelming. But they had one critical weakness that they didn't even realize. They were completely predictable. Every Xanthari commander followed the same tactical manual. Every fleet used the same formations. Every invasion followed the same pattern. They believed their system was perfect because it had worked 23 times. Before, they couldn't imagine that perfection itself could be a weakness. But Deho could see it clearly now. The Xanthari were like a master chess player who had memorized every possible move and counter-move. They were unbeatable as long as their opponents played by the rules of chess. But what happened when someone flipped the board over, scattered the pieces, and started playing an entirely different game? The files showed that the Xanthari had predicted human resistance would collapse within 72 hours of the initial attack. They had calculated that survivors would either surrender or die trying to fight using conventional tactics. They had accounted for every possible human response except one: the possibility that a human would survive in a makeshift shelter built from garbage and then spend his time studying his enemies instead of mourning his losses. Deho leaned back in his cramped shelter and stared at the data scrolling across his screen. The Xanthari had made their empire by eliminating chaos and imposing perfect order on the galaxy. They had destroyed 23 civilizations to maintain that order. Now, they were about to learn why chaos was the most powerful force in the universe. 3 weeks had passed since the massacre. Deho had transformed his floating prison into something the Xanthari would never expect: a weapons platform. The New Dawn's main reactor had been damaged, but not destroyed, and Deho had spent every waking hour carefully removing it from the wreckage and turning it into the galaxy's most dangerous booby trap, working in his makeshift shelter. He had painstakingly rewired the reactor's containment systems. Instead of producing steady power, it would now create a massive explosion when triggered. The radiation would be deadly, the heat would melt metal, and the electromagnetic pulse would fry every electronic system within kilometers. It was crude, dangerous, and absolutely perfect for what he had in mind. The hardest part was learning to speak like the enemy, using the captured communication equipment. Deho had spent days listening to Zenthari military chatter, learning their language, patterns and protocol codes. The aliens spoke in precise, clipped sentences that sounded more like computer commands than natural speech. Everything was numbered, categorized, and filed according to their rigid system. When he finally transmitted his false distress signal, Deho made his voice sound exactly like a damaged Zenthari ship's automated emergency system. Imperial Patrol Vessel Designation 77 Alpha requesting immediate assistance. Hull breach in Sectors 4 through 9. Life support failing. Require emergency evacuation. The response came within hours. A sleek patrol ship materialized from hyperspace, its sensors immediately scanning the debris field. It was much smaller than the massive dreadnoughts that had destroyed the New Dawn, but it was still 3 times larger than any human warship. Its hull was covered in the same dark metal that seemed to absorb light, and weapon ports lined its sides like deadly eyes. Deho watched from his hiding spot as the alien ship approached cautiously. The Zenthari were suspicious by nature, but their own protocols demanded that they investigate distress calls from Imperial vessels. They moved slowly through the debris field, their sensors sweeping back and forth as they searched for the source of the signal. When the patrol ship reached the optimal position, Deho held his breath and triggered the reactor. The explosion was magnificent and terrible. The New Dawn's reactor core released 3 weeks' worth of stored energy in a single instant, creating a miniature star that lit up the entire system. The blast waves swept outward, hurling debris in every direction, and creating a chaos of light and motion that would blind any sensor system. In the confusion, Deho launched himself from his shelter. He had modified his emergency suit with thruster packs salvaged from the wreckage, and he flew through the chaos like a missile aimed at the enemy ship. The Zenthari vessel was damaged, but not destroyed, exactly as he had planned. Its shields had absorbed most of the blast, but the electromagnetic pulse had knocked out several of their systems. The alien ship's hull was breached in 3 places, and Deho aimed for the largest opening, slammed into the damaged airlock. With bone-jarring force, his suit's emergency systems automatically sealing him inside. For a moment, he lay still in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the enemy ship around him. The Zenthari crew was in complete panic. Their perfect protocols had no instructions for dealing with an attack from inside a debris field. They had sensors that could detect a mouse from orbit, but they couldn't understand how someone could survive in open space for 3 weeks and then launch a suicide attack using their own reactor as a weapon. Deho moved through the ship like a ghost, using maintenance shafts and emergency corridors to avoid the main crew areas. The Zenthari were tall, thin beings with pale skin and large black eyes. They moved with mechanical precision, but their movements were jerky and uncertain now that their perfect system had been disrupted. He eliminated the crew one by one, using tools and weapons he found on the ship itself. The aliens were individually weak, relying on their technology and numbers for protection. When faced with an enemy who didn't follow any known tactical doctrine, they simply couldn't adapt fast enough. Within 6 hours, Deho was standing on the bridge of a Zenthari patrol ship, surrounded by alien technology he was only beginning to understand. The vessel's computer systems were still active, connected to the vast military network that controlled the entire Zenthari empire. He had weapons, shields, faster-than-light travel, and most importantly, access to enemy communications. The real war was about to begin. The Zenthari had just given their greatest enemy the tools he needed to destroy them. Deho spent his first week aboard the captured Zenthari ship learning how their technology worked. The alien computers were unlike anything humans had ever built. Instead of the chaotic jumble of cables and circuits he was used to, everything was perfectly organized. With each system connected to every other system in flawless harmony, the Zenthari Empire stretched across thousands of star systems, but it operated like a single giant organism. Every ship, every space station, every command center was linked through quantum communication networks that allowed instant coordination across impossible distances. When a Zenthari admiral on one side of the galaxy gave an order, Every ship in the fleet would receive it at exactly the same moment, no matter how far apart they were. It was their greatest strength. And Daiho realized it could also be their greatest weakness. He started small, introducing tiny glitches into their sensor networks. A patrol ship would report enemy contacts that didn't exist. A supply convoy would receive navigation data that was off by just a few degrees. Fleet formations would break apart as individual ships received slightly different versions of the same orders. The beauty of it was that each change was so minor that no single Zenthari officer would notice anything wrong. But when millions of tiny errors started adding up across their entire empire, the results were spectacular. Within days, Zenthari ships were firing on each other, convinced they were under attack by invisible enemies. Supply convoys began arriving at the wrong coordinates, leaving entire fleets stranded without fuel or ammunition. Command centers started issuing contradictory orders as their perfect communication system began to break down. But Daiho's favorite trick was the false emergency signals. He would make a ship's computer think it was under attack, triggering automatic distress calls that would bring rescue fleets rushing to defend empty space. Soon, half the Zenthari Navy was chasing phantoms while the other half was trying to figure out why their sensors were malfunctioning. The chaos spread through their network like a virus. It's growing stronger with each passing day. The Zenthari had built their empire on perfect order and absolute predictability. They had never imagined that someone could use their own perfection against them. As Daiho worked deeper into their classified files, he discovered something that changed everything. Hidden in the military archives were reports of failed extermination operations. Not every human colony had been completely destroyed. Across the galaxy, small groups of survivors had somehow managed to escape the massacre. The files told incredible stories of human ingenuity and stubbornness. On the colony world of New Sol, a group of miners had survived by hiding in underground tunnels for months. On the research station orbiting Kepler 442, a handful of scientists had escaped in a damaged shuttle and were now living in the asteroid belt. On the agricultural world of New Busan, farmers had organized a resistance movement that was still fighting 3 months after the official extermination was supposed to be complete. Each group had survived in a different way, but they all shared the same impossible human trait. They simply refused to give up. The Zenthari had calculated that human resistance would collapse within 72 hours. But they had underestimated the one thing that couldn't be measured or predicted: the human spirit. Daiho realized that he wasn't alone in his war against the Zenthari. Scattered across the galaxy were dozens, maybe hundreds of other humans who were fighting their own battles against impossible odds. They didn't know about each other. They certainly didn't know about the chaos. He was spreading through the enemy's communication networks, but that was about to change. Using his access to the Zenthari military network, Daiho began searching for ways to contact the other survivors. The aliens monitored all normal communication channels. But they had one blind spot. They assumed that any signals coming from their own military networks were legitimate. He started sending coded messages, hidden inside routine Zenthari communications, using frequencies and protocols that only a human engineer would recognize. The messages were simple. You are not alone. Help is coming. Stay strong. The Zenthari Empire was about to learn that the most dangerous thing you can do to humans is scatter them across the galaxy and assume they'll stay scattered forever. First response came from the asteroid belt around what used to be the colony world of New Sol. The signal was weak and filled with static. But Daiho could hear the excitement in the young woman's voice as she whispered into her communicator, "Is Han so young? I can't believe someone else is alive out there. I've been hiding in mining station Gamma 7 for 2 months, living off emergency rations and recycled air." The Zenthari destroyed everything else, but they never bothered to check the old mining tunnels. So Young was only 19 years old, fresh out of engineering school when the attack came. She had been working on the mining station's computer systems when the Zenthari fleet arrived. While her entire world burned below, she had managed to shut down the station's power grid and life support systems, making it look abandoned from the outside. For months, She had been living like a ghost in the machine, slowly repairing damaged equipment and trying to figure out how to survive. The Xanthari had scanned the asteroid belt dozens of times, but their sensors couldn't detect life signs inside a station that was supposed to be dead. The second voice came from the jungle world of New Inchin, where the trees grew so thick that sunlight never reached the ground. Lieutenant Cho Minho had been leading a platoon of colonial marines when the Xanthari invasion began. Most of his men had died in the first wave, but a few had escaped into the wilderness. "We've been hitting their supply convoys for weeks," Minho reported, his voice hard with anger and determination. "They set up a garrison in the capital city, but they're too scared to patrol the jungle. We know this terrain better than they do, and we're making them pay for every step they take." The Marine had turned the dense jungle into a maze of traps and ambushes. Every time the Xanthari tried to expand their control beyond the cities, they found themselves fighting an enemy that could disappear into the trees like smoke. Minho and his surviving soldiers had become legends among the local resistance fighters, proving that humans could fight back even when outnumbered, 1,000 to 1. But the most disturbing contact came from a hidden research facility orbiting a dead star. Dr. Yoon Hajin had been working on classified biological weapons when the Xanthari fleet arrived at her system. Instead of evacuating, she had gone underground, literally sealing herself inside a secret laboratory that didn't officially exist. "I've been studying their physiology," she said, her voice cold and clinical. "The Xanthari aren't as invincible as they think. Their immune systems are perfect for their homeworld, but they're vulnerable to modified Earth bacteria. I've been developing something that could level the playing field." Hajin had turned her grief into a weapon, spending months creating biological agents that could target Xanthari biology specifically. She wasn't just fighting for revenge. She was fighting to ensure that humanity would never again be caught defenseless. As more survivors made contact, a pattern emerged. Each group had found a different way to survive, but they all shared the same impossible human trait. They simply refused to give up. The Xanthari had calculated that human resistance would collapse within days, but they had underestimated the power of pure stubbornness. The survivors began sharing information, coordinating their attacks, and most importantly, spreading chaos throughout the Xanthari Empire. They didn't follow any military doctrine because they were making it up as they went along. When conventional tactics failed, they tried something completely different. When the enemy adapted to their methods, they changed their methods entirely. So-young used her engineering skills to hack into Xanthari communication networks, spreading false information and creating confusion among their fleets. Minho's guerrilla fighters started using captured alien weapons in ways they were never designed to be used. Hajin's biological weapons began appearing in Xanthari, food supplies and air filtration systems. The perfectly ordered Xanthari Empire began to experience something they hadn't felt in millennia: fear. Their troops started jumping at shadows. Their commanders began questioning their orders. Their perfect unity began to crack under the pressure of fighting an enemy that refused to follow any rules. The humans weren't winning yet, but they were proving something far more important. They couldn't be completely defeated. And in a war of extermination, survival itself was a form of victory. As word spread through the hidden quantum channels, more human survivors began emerging from impossible hiding places across the galaxy. They came crawling out of ventilation shafts, abandoned space stations, crashed ships, underground bunkers that the Xanthari had never thought to check. Each group had a different story, but they all shared the same incredible trait: they had refused to die when death was the only logical option. There was Kim Taeho, cargo pilot, who had been living inside the hull of his own destroyed freighter for 4 months. Surviving on emergency rations and rainwater he collected from hull breaches. The Xanthari had marked his ship as debris, never imagining that someone could turn wreckage into a home. Park Ewu had been a restaurant owner on New Gwangju when the invasion began. She had hidden her entire family in the restaurant's freezer, then spent weeks sneaking out at night to gather supplies from the ruins. When the Xanthari finally gave up their search and left the planet, she emerged to find herself leading a community of 300 survivors who had followed her example. Lee Hyunsu was a mechanic who had been working on a deep space mining rig when the attack came. He had disabled the rig's transponder and drifted in the asteroid belt for months, slowly converting the mining equipment into weapons. Now he was leading hit-and-run attacks against Zenthari patrol ships, using industrial cutting lasers as artillery. Each survivor brought unique skills and knowledge to the growing resistance network. But more importantly, they brought something that the Zenthari could never understand: the ability to adapt to any situation, no matter how impossible it seemed. From his stolen ship, Daeho coordinated increasingly bold attacks across the Empire. The Resistance didn't follow any military doctrine because they were inventing new tactics every day. When the Zenthari expected them to retreat, they attacked. When logic said they should surrender, they fought harder. When conventional weapons failed, they turned household items into explosives. They hijacked supply convoys by disguising themselves as Zenthari maintenance crews, then disappeared into asteroid fields before anyone realized what had happened. They reprogrammed automated defense systems to fire on their own ships, creating chaos in heavily defended systems. They even managed to infiltrate a Zenthari communication relay and broadcast human music across an entire sector, driving the alien crews to distraction with the chaotic sounds of jazz and rock. Each victory was achieved through methods that the computer could predict, because the humans themselves didn't know what they were going to do until they did it. They would wake up in the morning, look at their situation, and simply ask themselves, what would really annoy the Zenthari today? The aliens began to understand the magnitude of their mistake. Every other species they had eliminated had been logical, predictable, and civilized. The Karathi had honor codes that could be exploited. The Villani had logical thought processes that could be manipulated. The Thraxians had social hierarchies that could be disrupted. But humans were none of these things. They were chaos incarnate, and chaos was spreading through the Empire like a virus. Zenthari commanders, who had never lost a battle, were now afraid to leave their ships. Perfect formations were breaking apart as crews reported impossible sensor readings. Supply lines that had functioned flawlessly for centuries were now unreliable. The Zenthari leadership convened emergency sessions on their homeworld, trying to develop countermeasures against an enemy that refused to follow any rules. Their best tactical computers ran millions of simulations, but they couldn't predict human behavior because humans themselves didn't know what they were going to do next. How do we fight an enemy that doesn't even know what they're going to do until they do it? Asked the Zenthari Supreme Commander, his voice filled with something his species hadn't experienced in millennia. Uncertainty. The answer was simple and terrifying. They couldn't. You can't prepare for chaos, you can only try to survive it. And humanity was just getting started. 6 months after the massacre of the New Dawn, Daeho stood on the observation deck of his stolen Zenthari ship, staring at the most heavily defended world in the galaxy. The Zenthari homeworld was a perfect sphere of gleaming metal and crystal, its surface covered in cities that looked like they had been designed by a computer and built by machines. No chaotic human settlements here, no random growth or messy neighborhoods. Everything was precisely planned, mathematically perfect, and utterly sterile. Getting to this point had taken months of careful planning and intelligence gathering. The human resistance network had grown to include nearly 1,000 survivors across dozens of star systems, and they had been feeding Daeho information about Zenthari military movements, security protocols, and defensive systems. Every piece of data had been bought with human blood and sacrifice. The infiltration itself was almost disappointingly easy. Daeho had learned to perfectly mimic Zenthari communication patterns, and his stolen ship was still broadcasting valid military identification codes. The orbital defenses that could have vaporized entire fleets simply ignored him as he flew past, treating him as just another patrol vessel returning from a routine mission. The Central Command facility was located deep beneath the planet's surface, protected by layers of armor, energy shields, and automated defenses. But the Zenthari had made one crucial mistake. They had never imagined that someone would attack them from inside their own network. Daeho's stolen ship had full access to their military systems, and he walked through their most secure facility like he owned the place. what he found in the deepest levels of the command center changed everything he thought he knew about the war. The Xanthari leadership wasn't a group of evil conquerors plotting galactic domination. They were a council of frightened, dying beings desperately trying to preserve their perfect world from contamination. Their species had achieved technological perfection centuries ago, but that perfection had come at a terrible cost. They had eliminated genetic diversity in pursuit of physical perfection, leaving them vulnerable to diseases that would barely affect other species. They had removed all unpredictability from their society, creating a culture that couldn't adapt to changing circumstances. They had built machines to handle every aspect of their lives, leaving them unable to innovate when those machines failed. The Xanthari weren't destroying other species out of malice or conquest. They were destroying them out of pure terror. Every chaotic, unpredictable, adaptive species in the galaxy represented everything they had given up in their pursuit of perfection. They couldn't allow these species to exist because they were living. Proof that the Xanthari had chosen the wrong path. Humans were the worst of all because they embodied everything the Xanthari feared most: genetic diversity, cultural chaos, technological innovation, and the ability to adapt to any situation. Humanity represented the path not taken, a choice the Xanthari had rejected long ago. Their greatest fear was also their potential salvation, but they were too rigid to accept it. They would rather commit genocide than admit they had been wrong. For the past 1,000 years, Deho spent hours in their central computer core, uploading the most devastating virus he had ever created. This wasn't just a simple malware program. It was a digital representation of human chaos logic, designed to spread through every connected system in their empire. It would turn their own automated defenses against them, making their perfect order consume itself from within. As alarms began to sound throughout the facility, Deho activated every communication system in the building. His voice echoed through every speaker, every computer terminal, every device connected to the Xanthari network. It was broadcast to every ship, every station, every world in their empire. This is Kim Deho of the Human Resistance. You destroyed our worlds, killed our families, and tried to eliminate our species. You thought you had one because you left no survivors, but you made one critical mistake. The Xanthari leadership watched in horror as their perfect system began to turn against them. Defense turrets started firing on their own ships. Navigation computers began sending fleets to the wrong coordinates. Communication networks started broadcasting human music instead of military orders. You should have made sure we were all dead, Deho continued, his voice filled with quiet satisfaction. Because leaving even one human alive means you've already lost. We don't give up. We don't surrender. We never ever forget. The perfect Xanthari empire began to devour itself. Guided by human chaos logic they couldn't comprehend, the collapse of the Xanthari empire didn't happen all at once like an explosion. Instead, it unraveled slowly, like a perfectly woven tapestry coming apart thread by thread. Within the first week, their automated defense systems had turned against them, firing on their own ships and installations. Supply networks that had functioned flawlessly for centuries began delivering weapons to rebel groups instead of military supplies. Communication arrays that once carried precise military orders now broadcast human resistance messages. Jazz music and chaotic human laughter across the galaxy. The virus that Deho had planted in their central command network spread like wildfire through every connected system. It didn't just break their technology. It introduced the concept of chaos into minds that had never experienced unpredictability. Xanthari commanders who had never made a decision without consulting their computers suddenly found themselves facing dumb sways, situations that no algorithm could solve. Some Xanthari ships simply stopped functioning as their crews became paralyzed by the infinite possibilities of chaos. Others turned their weapons on themselves, unable to cope with the breakdown of their perfect order. A few actually surrendered to human resistance groups, begging for mercy from the very species they had tried to exterminate. The homeworld itself became a monument to the failure of perfect order. The gleaming cities that had once represented The pinnacle of Zenthari achievement now stood empty, their automated systems locked in endless loops of conflicting commands. The population had either fled to distant colonies or retreated so far into their underground shelters that they might as well have been extinct. Daiho emerged from the ruins of the Central Command Facility 3 days after the collapse began. He wasn't carrying weapons or wearing armor like a conquering hero. Instead, he looked like what he had always been, a human engineer who had simply refused to die when death was the logical choice. The other survivors found him there, standing among the wreckage of the most powerful empire in galactic history. Han So-young arrived in a ship she had built from salvaged parts and pure determination. Lieutenant Cho Min-hul brought a small fleet of converted mining vessels crewed by resistance. Fighters from a dozen different worlds. Dr. Yoon Ha-jin came with medical supplies and a grim smile. Having finally found a use for her biological weapons research that didn't require killing anyone, together they began the long process of rebuilding. But they weren't trying to recreate the old human civilization that had been destroyed. They had learned something important during their months of hiding and fighting. In a universe that valued order above all else, humanity's greatest strength was its refusal to conform to anyone else's expectations. The new human settlements that grew from the ashes of the war were unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. They were chaotic, unpredictable, and absolutely impossible to categorize. Some were built inside asteroid fields using salvaged alien technology. Others floated in the void between stars, powered by exotic energy sources that human engineers had jury-rigged from captured equipment. A few were even established on former Xanthari worlds, where humans lived alongside. The few alien survivors who had learned to appreciate the beauty of controlled chaos. Years passed. The galaxy slowly recovered from the trauma of the Zenthari collapse, but the other species never forgot what they had witnessed. Humanity had proven that even the most powerful empire could be brought down by a single individual who refused to accept defeat. Standing on the observation deck of New Sol Station, a massive human outpost built from the wreckage of a dozen different alien ships, Daiho looked out at the stars and smiled. The station was a perfect example of human engineering. It shouldn't have worked according to any known principles, but it functioned better than most purpose-built facilities. It was chaotic, unpredictable, and absolutely impossible to duplicate. Species would try to eliminate humanity in the future. It would study human behavior, develop perfect plans, and launch campaigns designed to remove the chaos factor from their ordered universe. But they would all face the same problem the Zenthari had encountered. You can't predict what humans will do, because humans don't even know what they're going to do until they do it. They adapt, improvise, and survive in ways that no computer can calculate and no tactical manual can anticipate. They turn their greatest weaknesses into their greatest strengths, and they never, ever give up. The galaxy had learned an important lesson. The most dangerous thing you can do to a human is leave them alive when you meant to kill them all. Because sooner or later, that human will figure out how to turn your own perfection against you, and that's exactly how humanity survives. The end.